Okay, so now what I want to talk about is the way in which there was that movement then from this idea of Aboriginal people being the most primitive people, and how that got translated then into some actions around what was termed Aboriginal protection. So protection ideas really start with colonisation and go through the 1800s, and then in the 1900s become part of the legislative ways that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples were controlled. So I want to talk about that. And then I'm going to bring in the lens of Michel Foucault, who is a theorist used by some sociologists to consider issues around power and control. So you might remember from previous lectures or other studies or knowledge that in the very first instructions to Governor Phillip in the colony, Aboriginal people were to fall under the protection of the Crown. All right. But when we look in the 1800s, the way in which protection was often used was as a means of justifying the movement of missionaries into Aboriginal communities and the placement of Aboriginal people on missions. Okay, so Christian missionaries tended to talk about, firstly, Aboriginal people needing to be protected from themselves. So most saw Aboriginal people as living in a state of sin, as defined through their Christian lens. But they also talk in their letters and journals about violence against Aboriginal people, about sexual mistreatment, particularly of Aboriginal women. So there's definitely, I guess, a two-pronged impetus for missionaries to argue that Aboriginal people needed protection. Now, as the 1800s progressed, the idea that Aboriginal people would die out was also strongly promoted. And so many missionaries saw it as their role to, quote, smooth the dying pillow for Aboriginal people. Okay? And much of what they focused on was that Aboriginal people needed to be transformed into this white, civilized Christian person. Okay? And so for many of the missionaries, for people to receive assistance, they needed to conform to the mission practices. Okay? And it's that idea of conformity that spread across the country, where Christian missionaries distributed goods and offered shelter on the condition of taking on Christianity. Okay? And European dress. This is an example here from a mission in Queensland. So it's taken at the end of the 1800s. And so it was very much about the transformation of Aboriginal people and the leaving behind, that in their terminology, the leaving behind of Aboriginal cultural traditions. Okay, so while there were some missionaries, for instance, who attempted to translate the Bible into Aboriginal languages, it was far more common for missionaries to ban the use of Aboriginal languages on mission sites. So initially, the missionaries, are really acting as agents of the church. But one of the things that we can see is that churches have been an integral part of the colonial project internationally. Okay, so it's not as if they stood apart from the actions of the state. All right. So Firstly, they're acting as agents of the church, but then missionaries, I think, very clearly move to also be seen as agents of the state. So a really strong example, which is quite close to us here in Newcastle, is the Aboriginal Inland Mission. All right, so those of you that might be familiar, just north of Newcastle, the Karua Mission. This was run by the Aboriginal Inland Mission, or AIM. All right, and this is a copy of their newsletter. Okay, salvation to the Aborigines, and our aim to give light to them that sit in darkness. So this was both a reflection of the beliefs of Christianity. So, you know, to live a non-Christian life was to be in darkness, and there's, you know, a whole lot of ways in which the coming of Christianity is seen as the bringing of light. Okay, and also, you know, very much this idea of a transformation. We can see in this tile from, you know, Aboriginal shelter to the mission cottages. Okay, so in some cases, the missions that already existed came under the regulation of the new Protection Acts, and it was the missionaries who stayed on to administer those missions. But instead of doing it for the church, they were doing it for the state. Okay, so receiving some monies from state governments, and also sometimes, you know, some monies from the church as well. Okay, so we know that depending on the area that people were living in, that there tends to have been different Christian denominations that were represented. So, for instance, Lutheran Christianity was quite common in Central Australia, and then we can see that, you know, some Aboriginal communities, you know, might have a stronger history of Catholicism or Protestantism, and that often depends on what denomination the local missionaries were. Okay, so we know that missionaries also, you know, featured in some of the higher level discussions around Aboriginal protection. Okay, so there was generally a representative of at least one of the Christian churches on the Aboriginal protection boards. Okay, and we know that they tended to respond to inquiries on the state of missions and Aboriginal people. What we also know is that in acting as agents of the state, there were many examples of missionaries who practiced, you know, quite serious physical punishment on both Aboriginal adults and children. And we also know from other inquiries that there was sometimes the abuse of their position in terms of, you know, things such as sexual abuse. So what I think is interesting is that we'll find some Aboriginal people and sometimes some communities who are quite vociferously against the missionary tradition and its role as a protector. And in other cases, we'll find Aboriginal communities who talk about the missionaries as having been benign and paternal or maternal figures, and, you know, and still following that particular Christian tradition. So it would be untrue to say that all Aboriginal peoples speak negatively of the missionary experience. And I think, you know, we just kind of need to be mindful of that, particularly if we're working in communities. Okay, so what we can also see is that missionaries, tended to form part of the upper echelon of the social structures in their communities. Okay, and this was particularly true, in your rural and remote communities. And so they tended to share power with other people who had, not just social standing, but also some kind of power in terms of being, agents of the state. So we know, for instance, that missionaries, often worked with police to regulate Aboriginal people. Yeah. So we know that people who were deemed, in inverted commas, as troublemakers were sometimes ejected from the mission and then simultaneously picked up by the local police for being vagrants. Okay, so there's a whole range of ways in which there were actions that could move Aboriginal people very quickly into a position of being, deemed to be contravening other laws. Okay, so I think that it is such a loaded history, and it's so diverse that we need to make sure, for instance, if we're doing essays or talking circle orations, that we don't just say, well, yeah, kind of missionaries did this, but some missionaries did this. But it wasn't only missionaries who were co-opted into being agents of the state. All right, so I want to bring in some theory here from the philosopher Michel Foucault, and he says, take the example of philanthropy in the early 19th century, so that's the 1800s. People appear who make it their business to involve themselves in other people's lives. Health, nutrition, housing. Then out of this confused set of functions, there emerge certain personages, institutions, forms of knowledge, public hygiene, inspectors, social workers, and psychologists. And we are now seeing a whole proliferation of different categories of social work. Naturally, it's medicine, which has played the basic role as the common denominator. Its discourse circulated one instance to the next. It was in the name of medicine, both that people came to inspect the layout of houses, and equally that they classified individuals as insane, criminal, or sick. And one of the things that we can see really clearly that happens in the 18 and 1900s, and I'd argue even into this century, is that there's a real preoccupation about things such as Aboriginal housing and sanitation that seems to require the state, through its own sets of responsibilities, to intervene. Okay? And it's always around this notion of intervention. We also see at the same time that there's a proliferation of ideas around doing something, quote, for their own good. That comes up a lot in the literature. All right. And, we can see, for instance, A.O. Neville, Chief Protector in Western Australia, who said, for despite themselves, Aboriginal people must be helped. So there's a definite sense in which Aboriginal people are constructed as being unfit to govern themselves. So that plays itself out medically in a whole range of ways. Firstly, there were ideas about Aboriginal capacity for intellectual thought, and Aboriginal people were generally constructed as being less capable intellectually. We see that missions were often seen as completely unsafe and unsanitary regarding intervention and removal of children, which is ironic given that the state was responsible for the mission. So if a child was removed because of the unfavourable conditions, that was actually the state speaking against itself. But when we look at the records, it's speaking against the Aboriginal community there, in particular, the parents. Okay. We also know that there were, the development of discourses about Aboriginal people being, medically less robust than non-Aboriginal people, so needing intervention there. And I guess, what that doesn't take into account is, things like the incredibly poor nutrition that came about when Aboriginal people, were forced to move from traditional diets to rations, which tended to be flour, tea, and sugar. All right. So what we find with protection is that there's often, this underlying medical model that constructs Aboriginal people as being incapable. And Jeremy Beckett, the anthropologist, has argued the extent of attempts to regulate the Indigenous body reflects a level of control that only the orphan and insane are subject to. Okay, so when we think about that, orphans are people without parents, okay, or guardians. And the insane, in this legal sense, are seen as people, who cannot manage their own affairs, who can't be held responsible for the actions that they take. All right. And so what we see in a lot of this protection legislation is the legal construction of Aboriginality as constituting peoples who cannot govern themselves, people who cannot be responsible for their own children, certainly people who cannot be responsible for managing their own money or, their own homes. And so we know that a major part of the mission tradition was the over-surveillance of Aboriginal people through the mission managers, okay, who had the right to enter people's homes at any time they chose. Okay, so how can we understand how this surveillance was enacted? Well, I think a really useful concept is what's called the panopticon. And the panopticon was an ideal prison which was designed by the philosopher Jeremy Bentham. Okay? And put simply, the panopticon had the prison guards in the centre. So we see that here. And then you put the cells around that centre and you shine a light into the cells. The idea being that, you know what it's like to try and look into a light. You actually can't see very clearly. So the idea is that the prisoners never know when they're being observed. And what they have to do because of that is to regulate their behaviour 100% of the time, because they might be being watched. Okay, so think about that as an idea. In fact, there might be no one in the centre, or they may have someone who's tasked with watching them 24 hours a day. The panopticon, I think, at its heart is the theory of you never know. Okay, you never know when they're watching. You never know when, there might be some kind of intervention from that power, but you need to make sure that you're behaving correctly 100% of the time. And to again turn to the work of Michel Foucault, he argued that the panopticon is the perfect model for modern governmentality, because so much of how governments maintain order is through, well, you never know when they're watching. Okay, so for instance, around tax time, you'll see the ads saying, do your taxes properly, because you never know. You may be the one to be audited this year. The practice of speed cameras also operates a lot like that. So if I'm driving up the freeway towards Newcastle, I know that at certain places the traffic will slow down. And that's because around the corner is a little lay-by where police cars often sit with their radar camera. Okay, they're not there 100% of the time. They're probably not even there 50% of the time. But for the potential that they might be there, people modify their behaviour. Similarly, the use of cameras, in malls or in shops operates in. Now, accompanying that was the legalising of workplace discrimination. All right, so we know that one of the things which Australian national narratives tend to hold dear is things like the Harvester Judgment, which set a wage, a living wage for a man, but that wasn't extended either to women or to Aboriginal people or other, a range of other racial or ethnic groups. But in terms of minimum wages for Aboriginal people, things were often even more dire. So, for instance, in 1901, the 1897 Queensland Act was amended and a minimum wage was legislated for all Indigenous workers who were working under permit. So for workers in the marine industry, predominantly those employed in the pearling industry, who were covered by the legislation, the wage was set at 10 shillings. Okay. For all other workers covered by the 1897 Queensland Act, the wage was set at 5 shillings, which is $24, which is less than 1/8 of the quote white wage. Okay. So what we see is that under this legislation, Aboriginal workers are created as an economic underclass. They're a reserve army of labour that, could be negotiated outside of their control to enter into these employment roles. Okay, so you might sort of question, well, why would you get more money in pearling? But one of the things that we know about the pearling industry was that, there are very high levels of, injury and death for Aboriginal workers. And that quite often, in these pearling industries, many of the other divers were non-white people. So depending on different places, for instance, we can see in Broome in Western Australia that the pearling industry was heavily reliant on Japanese pearl divers. And what we also know is that, many of those pearl divers entered into relationships with Aboriginal people. And so, you can sometimes see clusters of surnames that reflect those different ethnic heritages, which come from, often, relationships that started well over a century ago. Okay. So it was legal to pay Aboriginal workers less. And what we also see under this Protection Acts is that Aboriginal wages were taken by the protector. They were to be kept in specific accounts for that individual, But we know as part of, what's termed the stolen wages cases, that quite often the money wasn't given back to those individuals, and in fact was sometimes used, for things such as the general mission management. So one of the things that I think is really interesting is some of the language that occurs in the Protection Acts. So for instance, in 1909, the Aborigines Protection Act, or the New South Wales Act, was introduced, which formally set out the duties of the New South Wales Board. And that included to provide for the custody, maintenance and education to the children of Aborigines, and to exercise a general supervision and care over all matters affecting the interests and welfare of Aborigines, and to protect them against injustice, imposition and fraud. And I think one of the things which is really ironic about that is that when we look at royal commissions like the Royal Commission into the removal of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children from their families, when we look at the issues of wage theft, in the stolen wages cases, when we actually look at testimony of Aboriginal people who lived on missions, what we often see is that these three things, injustice, imposition and fraud, are the very things which the Protection Acts facilitated rather than protecting Aboriginal people from. And I think testimony here is an incredibly important element. Okay, so there are literally thousands of Aboriginal testimonies about life on the missions under protection. And this is, I think one which helps us understand the context of what I've been talking about during the lecture. So it comes from someone who was a resident of Cherbourg Mission in Queensland. And they say, everything that related to a concentration camp was there in Cherbourg. You couldn't move without getting a permit. Cherbourg is built right on Bramble Creek. About 100 metres or so away from the river was the farmer's house. We had to get a permit to go down and fish there. We had to get a permit to go to Mergen, which was 4 miles away, 6 kilometres. And it had a time set on it. If you came back 5 to 10 minutes after that time expired, you would be put in jail for maybe a weekend. And they brought the curfew in. All lights had to be out at 9 o'clock. If you were found out after dark or after the lights had gone out, you were put in jail. They even put searchlights on the vehicles, the police, the superintendent, and chased blackfellas everywhere, hither and thither throughout the night hours. During the mid-40s, they took away our corroborees. They took away our culture. Our ancestors were not allowed to teach us our language. Most of us know nothing of our language. So this is in many ways, I think, indicative of, some of the broader issues that occurred under protection. So when you think about, what I was talking about with the panopticon and this idea of always being surveilled, imagine having to get a permit for the most simple of things. And then, knowing that if, for instance, you're only a couple of minutes late, that you are going to be jailed. What we can see is that in many missions and reserves, jail was used, fairly regularly to enforce, so-called discipline. Okay. We see examples here about searchlights on vehicles, okay, which again brings us to that idea of the panopticon. And this kind of ever-present role for police in enforcing, these rules that existed under protection. So I know, in my own family, my great-grandmother, who I'm named after, and my great-grandfather were placed on Karua mission. My great-grandmother had to go and work you know, as a teenager, as a domestic at Tarlee Bible College. We know that, you know, some of her brothers were, in essence, forced to go and work as labourers and stockmen. Okay, and when my great-grandparents were married, they had to have the permission of the protector to be able to marry. And if he had said no, you know, there's no appeal against that. You know, they couldn't have married. We know that they were allowed to leave the mission. But I can also find in records that 20 years after they left the mission, the missionaries were still referring to them as their faithful servants. So we know that even after Aboriginal people left missions, that they were still under the surveillance of missionaries and managers. And that if they were seen as not conforming to the standards of behaviour that these missionaries or managers expected or demanded, they could be taken from their homes and put back onto the mission. So even for Aboriginal people who had been what was called exempted from the Act, the surveillance continued. And I think it's hardly surprising then that for some families, you know, they chose to move away and to deny their Aboriginality. Okay, and so we see many of those people, you know, returning to Aboriginal communities now to try and, you know, reinvigorate and remake their connection. So it is something, I think, which is incredibly, long-standing. It provides these multi-generational effects and certainly, you know, a really pervasive culture of fear and distrust for many Aboriginal people. So we can also see that, you know, through that testimony, Aboriginal people are having the ability to critically comment on what they see as the success of protection. And the late Uncle Bob Randall, an Aboriginal elder, says, "You threw me a line called welfare, but it's not as good as what I had. The chaos and sadness we are feeling now is a result of our history. Open truth will set us free, not hidden truth." Okay, so again, you know, this idea of being able to tell these stories, I think, is incredibly significant.